Hey guys, welcome back. Probably our last ed puzzle before we come back to school. We're going to talk about the progressive period. Our last ed puzzle focused on really the beginning of this era, which is the populist movement that we see take place in the Midwest in response to the troubles of the farmer. The progressive movement is really a reaction to the evils of the Gilded Age that we focused so much on last chapter, and then you're working on currently with your project. And the hope here is to fix the economic, political, social divide in the country that exists. And the belief of progressivism, and if you think of progressivism, literally the root word, as you can see in this political cartoon, is progress. We are trying to move forward with change that will fix the inequalities that have existed before. And progressives, people who believe in this movement, thought that democracy was the cure to the problems of inequality that had existed economically and politically. If we increase democracy, give people more opportunity to participate in the political process, then we can try to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. It would also end the stranglehold of political bosses, right? If you're allowing people more direct election, for example, of their senators, which we'll talk about, you eliminate the power of bosses. By increasing people's opportunities to participate in government, you can get a hold on trust and its exploitation of not only consumers, but of workers, and begin to rein in really the social Darwinist tendencies that have begun to emerge in laissez-faire capitalism during the Gilded Age. And the idea here is more of a transition of what is the role of government? What should government be doing? And the belief among progressives is that it should respond to the needs of people. And we're certainly going to see that, under FDR and the New Deal, the creation of what's called a welfare state. And that's not a negative term. That's more of a reference to a government that responds to the needs of the people and legislates accordingly. This is not a new idea. The progressive era is not by any means some magical new reform that has existed. Reform movements have existed for decades in the United States, going all the way back to the period of Andrew Jackson, even before that. Certainly, a lot of their momentum is gained from the success of the populists in the election of 1896. One could certainly argue that a lot of these ideas are very socialist, and we see the influence of European socialism on progressivism, but they are not interested in ridding the United States of capitalism. They would much rather just really curb its ills and bring in kind of the extreme nature of that economic force. And the hope is that they're going to work within the system to solve it. Most of these people are middle class that we're going to see, and much of the progressive period starts in Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin in particular was a rather liberal institution for the time period. And it's going to generate a lot of the movement, particularly at the University of Wisconsin and with Governor Rob La Follette, who will lead that charge in Wisconsin. But really the first group that begins to pave the way for the success of the progressive movement are what's called the muckrakers. And you see just a few of them. There are several more on the screen there. They are journalists, generally expose journalists, who write about some particular evil of society to make people and politicians aware. They have absolutely no problem naming names. They have no problem going going after the high elite. And the term muckraker comes, as we read in our article, from Teddy Roosevelt. That refers to a book from a character from Pilgrim's Progress, where these individuals spent so much time digging dirt that they don't look up to see the rest of society. And then in this case, Teddy Roosevelt was almost criticizing them for what they were doing by digging up all the filth of society, but they really wear it as a badge of honor. There are several very important ones that we're going to talk about that you're going to read in the books. But I'm just going to go through a couple. Upton Sinclair, who writes The Jungle, is really responsible for the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act. We read his excerpt as well as the article on him. Lincoln Steffens is notable in particular for Rhode Island. He wrote articles on government corruption, both in Rhode Island and also Philadelphia. And he wrote Rhode Island, A State for Sale, which you're going to take the time to read right now. Ida Tarbell wrote an expose about John D. Rockefeller. It's called The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her father had been put out of business because of the sweating practices that we spoke of in the last chapter from Rockefeller. And she wrote a really hard-hitting expose talking about all the terrible things that he did. Jacob Riis focused on tenement housing in New York City in particular, and what life was like for immigrants in a book of photographs called How the Other Half Lives. Frank Norris wrote a novel called The Octopus. A number of these authors, including Upton Sinclair, for example, wrote novels to expose their work, even though Sinclair's is much more targeted to the working class and the plight of the workers. But Frank Norris continued on the trend of the problems of the farmer by writing about how railroads were their single biggest enemy, which we had talked about. John Spargo wrote about the Breaker Boys in Pennsylvania, the children that worked in the coal fields, in a book called The Bitter Cry of Children. David Phillips wrote a series of articles about what's called the treason of the Senate. If you remember last chapter, we looked at that political cartoon and how the trust dominated the Senate, and it was no longer driven by the people. And this will be motivation for the 17th Amendment. Unfortunately, as often happens with these kinds of movements, it takes a real tragic event to really make a big leap forward. And then in this case, we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This was a business in Chicago that broke every single possible labor law that you could possibly imagine. Remember, they didn't really exist at the time period where they're just coming into fruition. But a fire breaks out in this company that was worked entirely by young girls, mostly Jewish and Italian girls. They would bar all the windows with gates. They would block the doors with towels and clothes, so no heat could get out. And this fire breaks out, and almost every single woman dies in this. Many of them were forced to try and break through those bars windows and leap out several stories high to their death rather than perish in the flames. The owner of the factory was indicted but not convicted of manslaughter. But this singular event really is going to be the cause behind building codes and establishment of regulation of labor laws. It's terribly unfortunate, but this is really going to be the catalyst that will push the labor movement and labor reform forward. We see by 1917, nearly every single state had started to limit the hours of women that were working in these kinds of industrial sites. They also began to set wage standards for women, which is very important, that had existed already for men in several states. We also get the enactment of things like workers' compensation, which we know from reading The Jungle did not exist. We're going to get the increase of factory inspections as a result of the Pure Food and Drug Administration. We're also going to see pension that will be provided to widows of factory workers. We're also starting to see, we certainly know that management and big business is going to push back, but we start to see the courts moving in favor of more of a progressive style. Mueller versus Oregon, very, very important case, 1908, upheld, really for the first time in a very long time, a law that limited the hours of working women. If you remember in one of our previous articles, New York state laws to limit acres hours were struck down by the court. And you can see the headlines that were, spread as a result of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And it's these headlines and this publicity that really, unfortunately, moves forward the progressive movement. There's also a big focus, not just on fixing labor laws, fixing things like food and drug protection laws, but also fixing democracy itself. Again, I told you progressives want to increase democracy, and we believe that as a result, evils will fall. And it begins with what's called the Wisconsin Plan at the University of Wisconsin. And it was really modeled after Governor Rob La Follette, who was well known for picking fights with his opponents, received the name Fighting Bob. And this quote here, I think, is really pertinent to the topic. He said, "Men must be aggressive for what is right, if government is to be saved from men who are aggressive for what is wrong. And I think that's really a great single quote that describes the progressive movement. And some of the things that they're going to focus on: women's suffrage. We're going to get the 19th Amendment that will guarantee the right of women to vote in 1920. It had already been adopted in several Midwest states. Remember, Midwest is the home of the progressive movement. We're going to get things enacted that are going to allow people to have much more of an involvement in their public officials. A recall, for example, where the public can take a vote to remove an elected official. That was thrown around in California just a few weeks ago. An initiative which actually allows the public to begin the legislative process. Let's say your elected officials aren't doing the job, maybe because it's not in their best monetary interests. Well, if a certain percentage of people vote for it, then a draft can be put forward about some issue to the state legislature. So it allows people to have a direct impact in the legislative process. A referendum, which exists all the time, we see them in Rhode Island, is a public vote on an issue. Let's not let the legislators who might have their hands, people might have hands in their pockets. Let's let the people decide on an issue. In particular, we see that with buildings at University of Rhode Island, for example, is one that always happens. And then the last one is a direct primary, where instead of letting bosses in back rooms with cigars choose who will be running for us, we're going to let people be involved in the nomination process. And this is where it's really the precursor to the national conventions that we get for the presidency every 4 years. We're also going to see them targeting the vices of society: tenement housing, alcohol, gambling, corruption. That's how Teddy Roosevelt gets his start in New York City. And we see it in Texas in particular. They uproot the entire government to establish a new progressive government. As a result, we're going to get real successful change by way of amendments. Remember, amendments are added to the Constitution to either change something or address something new. And this really just is the final stamp on how successful this movement is. We have the 16th Amendment, which creates the graduated income tax, which allows to hopefully bridge the gap between rich and poor. The more you make, the more you pay. This was actually deemed unconstitutional for a while by the Supreme Court, but an amendment overrides any Supreme Court decision. The 17th Amendment allows for the direct election of U.S. senators. Remember, you could not vote for your senators originally. That was only done by the state legislatures. And this eliminated really the backroom cigar boss who was picking senators for each party, and allows the people to get involved. The 18th Amendment targets in particular the vice of alcohol and prohibits the manufacturing, sale, or transportation of alcohol. This is a direct reaction to the temperance movement we talked about last year. And the last one is the 19th Amendment, which is women's suffrage. We're going to talk about their role in World War I and how some men said that women had earned, as if they needed to earn, the right to vote because of how important they were on the home front. This also has its roots in what we talked last year with the Seneca Falls Convention. So the progressive period is incredibly successful, gains its momentum and notoriety from the populace in William Jennings Bryan, and will then launch into a whole national campaign under the leadership, of Teddy Roosevelt.